Hello and welcome to the AI Pathfinder for Private Equity podcast. I'm on a mission to lead private equity from AI bewilderment to AI empowerment, and I'm doing that by building a dedicated network that will, piece by piece, create a playbook for successful AI adoption across private equity operations and the deal lifecycle. I'm meeting and having very interesting conversations with people within PE and across the AI value chain. I'm really pleased to bring some of those to life through this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the building blocks for successful AI mobilisation, which is the theme for my next private equity AI strategy breakfast briefing in London on the 3rd of December. Now, a recent report by RAND found that 84% of business leaders believe AI will have a significant impact on their business, but the majority aren't ready, leading to as many as 80% of AI projects failing, twice the failure rate of other IT projects. So how might private equity reverse this trend? Well, joining me today to talk about this is thought leadership expert Athena Peppers, technology trends advisor and director of Beacon, and Accenture alumni. Hello, Athena. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Steve, and thank you so much for inviting me. Pleasure to be with you this morning.
Thank you. Well, look, first things first, let's get a little bit more context on you, Athena. So I'd like, perhaps if you can, briefly tell me a bit about yourself and what you're doing now and where AI fits in.
Sure. So a bit about myself. I'm an economist at heart, but I've spent quite a lot of my career focused on researching and developing thought leadership for business topics, and particularly focused on the future of business. And obviously, AI is an important part of that at the moment. So as one of the directors at Beacon, we help companies shape their thought leadership. And you mentioned AI empowerment at the beginning when introducing this. So that's kind of quite important, because by doing some original research and developing your own thinking, your own thought leadership on this topic, it's kind of an essential element of AI empowerment as well. And that's what we are helping companies with at the moment.
Okay, so how do you see things have changed in terms of, well, certainly the thought leadership? What are you being asked to do in relation to AI more specifically? Are there this sort of concerns about the future state of certain industries, for example?
Yeah. So I remember working on a report on AI back in 2016, actually, and that was focused on understanding its economic potential and impact on productivity. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, and the field has obviously been around for a lot longer than that. But I think what's changed over the course of the last few years, and particularly the last 2 years, is that it's kind of come more into the public consciousness. So there's a lot more interest in understanding what AI is, what the impact it could be. So, obviously the launch of ChatGPT and generative AI becoming more commonplace is what changed that. We're coming up to the 2-year anniversary of the launch in November. So we are seeing companies kind of, more interested in the technology. I think one of the challenges that I'm seeing is that it's quite easy to talk about perhaps the cost savings, and the easy wins. What's a bit harder is to imagine how it can actually change the future of your industry. How can it create new growth? How can it augment a lot of what you do? Or, as an organization, for you individually, for your teams. So I think that's how you asked about, the evolution, right? So those are the two dimensions. One is definitely a lot more interest over time from all sorts of companies. And the other is that shift and that kind of organizations being keen to go beyond just the cost element to the new growth element that AI can unlock.
Yeah, and I assume that some of this is driven by concern as well around the validity of potentially some business models in the future as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And the concerns can be quite broad range. There's concerns around the impact on jobs, and how, or the concerns around kind of how do you help your people use the technology, for example, effectively. You talked about the RAND research that shows that the failure rate of AI is for AI projects is twice as high as that of just IT projects. And part of the reason for that is people not being able to actually use the technology. So you roll this out, it's seen as a technology transformation, but actually the people transformation is quite important element of it. There are concerns around data privacy and, the data that you share on these models. How will they be used in the future? Are you, in a sense, giving away interesting information that might mean in the future you're out of business? Essentially, like what's happening with some of the creative industries, right? Where, those tools, the recordings of podcasts, for example, are being used to train, new tools that can create podcasts. I don't know if you've seen that, the Google LM tool,
Yeah.
where you can
Yes.
basically give it an article and it converts into a podcast. So, I think that can apply to any industry, right? There's a concern that, well, if we share information about our competitive advantage while using these tools, because sometimes people might not realize that they're giving away that information as well. Does that mean that in the future we'll have, we're giving away some of that information to technology companies potentially? And there are, I guess, ways around that, like developing your own models and things like that, or customizing them, putting support systems for your data around that. But we can go into that a bit later.
Yeah, I think, well, perhaps summarizing, eyes wide open, really. And thought leadership is helping to, to fill any gaps there in terms of what the future may hold. Well, you've mentioned certainly people there, and if we just, go into what AI mobilization is now. Mobilization is a big factor when we're talking about any form of transformation, particularly digital transformation. But as we mentioned above, is the stat around potential failure rate, and so getting those foundations, all the components in place, not necessarily before you do anything, but it's important for us to recognize what those things are. Question for you from your perspective: what is AI mobilization, and why is it important for business to think of AI as more, more than just this is a sideline tech project?
So that's a very good question, because there have been already instances of companies that are piloting, experimenting, rolling out, these tools across the company. You get debates around, oh, but why are we not seeing some of those productivity benefits yet? At what point will it reach, the point where we kind of start seeing that return on the investment as well? And I think that, a lot of different factors come into it. One is time, right? Perhaps we expect things to happen a lot sooner, to see results a lot sooner, than we should. With projects around technology transformation, particularly AI, as you mentioned, it takes time for it to feed through. So at the point where it's adopted throughout the organization and can start having that impact. And we're just not at that stage yet. If you think of an adoption curve, and that adoption curve might vary depending on the industry and also the size of the companies you're talking about. Of course, when you're looking at, say, the tech sector, they're a lot more mature on that adoption curve. But if you're looking at other sectors, there was some research actually done by McKinsey looking at that curve. Manufacturing is a bit further behind. They're more at the experimentation and pilot stage. Consumer goods a bit further ahead. So each one is at a different stage. The other thing that comes into it is the size of the company as well. The budgets kind of allocated will differ across the size of the different size companies. A lot of the research that I've seen, the thought leadership on this topic, has been focused on very large companies. Okay. So, of course, you might see them kind of being a bit further on that adoption curve. But when you look at research around, say, medium-sized companies, there's definitely more of a gap in that space. And, initial research actually shows that not as many of them are adopting it. So why am I saying those two things? Because they're kind of part of seeing the benefits of a technology that economists call general purpose technology, like AI, like, electricity, things like that, is that it takes time for the impact to feed through and to kind of see the results in the numbers and in the way that we work and we function. And 2 years is probably not enough time, given these tools are relatively new.
Yeah, and there's cultural thing here that's obviously quite important to any sort of transformation. But there feels like there's, there can be appetite with emerging technology like AI to make a move, and that can come from the top. But rather than thinking about mobilization, it's almost a knee jerk, and so we're going to do something. And there's many proof of concepts that have been built, but then you get to a point where it's all pulled back because the mobilization piece hasn't happened. And that could be down to, it could be down to the people, the capabilities you've got, the infrastructure, and obviously they're really not having a joined up strategy. There's lots of reasons why people are finding it more difficult than maybe they expected to, with, a magic technology. So yeah, and it'd be good to think back at other sort of digital transformations and is mobilization better understood in other areas of the business, or is it just that there's a greater demand to do something here, so people are trying to move faster, and hence why there's more failure?
I mean, that my researcher kind of dimension is kicking in, and I'm thinking that that's something actually that would be interesting to look at. But I think you already touched on some areas, which is that AI transformation can be quite different to past waves of IT transformation that we've seen. And obviously, as humans, we all expect it to be similar to what we've seen before, but actually it can be a bit more complex, partly because the technology is more complex and it might take more time for people to understand how to use it. The other thing is that, looking back, we feel like maybe things happen faster, but actually it took a long time for these things to feed through, and taking like a bit of a different, a kind of broader perspective can help you think about that. So even things that we take for granted, like electricity and the internet, are not commonplace in some parts of the world, right? So there's always that divide, like different types of divides that come into it. One thing that helps me think about, AI mobilization, what kind of would drive success, is what I call the 3 Ps. It's just a good way to think about, what are the enabling factors. The 3 Ps are problem, people, and partners. So the problem is really the idea that you should be focused on, when you're thinking about doing pilots or how to roll out AI, you need to be very clear about why you're doing it. I think there's a risk that because of the hype, because of the public interest, we must do something on AI. What should we do? Let's just do this. And then the stakeholders are kind of underwhelmed by the results because they weren't necessarily focused on solving a particular problem for the business. And that problem might be a today problem or a future problem. Today problem might be more kind of, the cost aspect that we mentioned. The future problem might be, well, how can I develop this market, or how can I think about new business models? The second element is around people, and that's where kind of bringing them on board is important. So we talk a lot about skills and upskilling. Of course, that's important, right? Being able to use those tools, understanding how they work, what you can and can't use them for. But also you mentioned the word culture before. There's an element of that and bringing people along with you. I think that's a bigger challenge perhaps with AI because people fear it to some extent, right? There is that kind of like, well, but if I use this tool, could it take my job? And therefore, like, there's a vested interest in me conflict of interest in me using it because it might actually replace me. In fact, it could make you more productive. But I think that kind of that psychological and cultural piece as well definitely comes into bringing people along with you and successfully mobilizing for AI. And the third thing is partners, right? Sometimes it can also appear as quite an overwhelming thing to do, and of course it is. But can you look to other organizations, whether in your industry or different sets of partners that can help you create an ecosystem that delivers that project? Perhaps you're not sure where to start with your data, right? We haven't talked about data yet, and that's an important element. Could you work with a data audit company that helps you understand what kind of data sets you have, what's proprietary to you, how you can, use it in a way that also fits with all the regulations and requirements that are coming our way. So you don't need to have all that capability in-house. You can lean on kind of partners in the broader ecosystem to help you do that. So yeah, problem, people, and partners are kind of three ways to think about the enabling factors and how to successfully mobilize for AI. I mean, the other thing that's unique to every company is, of course, the data that they hold, right? So you mentioned like what are kind of some of the practical steps to get started. I think the problem definition is always the first thing. I know you talked about leadership buy-in, but ultimately, in my experience, at least, it tends to come from leadership buy-in, like kickstarting those projects. They're very hard to do, grassroots. You're not going to get someone doing that. You might get people using the tools and you not knowing about it at the leadership level and how it affects, and therefore not capture the benefits in your KPIs, for example, because you're not aware of what's happening. But the way it happens most times is that there is, at least from the function that starts it, some leadership buy-in, some budget. Now, whether that is the case across the board, whether you're siloed, of course, that's part of the success, of the success factors that come into it. If you don't have the buy-in in terms of the rest of the organization, then they might not see the benefits or be willing to do so. So that's why I haven't kind of focused on leadership buy-in too much, because I think that's where those projects tend to kick off. Someone will say, we think we should have a pilot around this, here's some budget, see what you can do with it, and wow me with the results. And that's where things can unravel, because it's a bit more complicated than that. It's not a discrete kind of tool. So once you have that, though, once you have got started and you've got that buy-in, then understanding what proprietary data you have is quite important. And every company will have some proprietary data. Now, what's quite interesting as well is the kind of structured versus unstructured data dimension of the business. So loads of companies tend to use mainly structured data that they've got, but the real kind of insights can come from unstructured data that you have. So I don't know, in a peer context, that might be conversations you have, with people, or that you have as a team, brainstorming about some ideas that are not, captured somewhere or codified in a spreadsheet. That would be unstructured data that you can capture and turn into insights. And the good thing is that generative AI in particular can use unstructured data quite well. So you don't even, it can work with that. You don't need to convert it into something else. Essentially, it learns from that unstructured data. So we've got the leadership buy-in, then you've kind of do your data leadership buy-in, problem definition, then data audit and kind of strategy around that. And then once you've kind of assuming the pilot's done well and you're looking to roll that out into other functions and scale it, then what you need is a lot of the people element, the culture element, making sure everything's integrated. You're taking people along in the journey with you, as we've discussed. Tracking the progress, that's another challenge that a lot of companies have, in the sense of some of the benefits are quite hard to capture. If it takes me 10 hours to write a piece of code instead of 30 hours, I can track that. If I come up with a new idea, how is that kind of captured in the KPIs and the metrics that you're following? I think that's something that organizations in general struggle with, capturing some of the intangibles that are actually quite beneficial. It's not just an AI problem, it's a more general problem when it comes to being innovative and creative.
Moving on to the challenges, the common challenges and mistakes that companies make, not necessarily just mobilizing for AI, but mobilizing for other transformations that have gone in the past. What are your thoughts on the watch outs there?
If we're to take a broader lens in terms of transformation, business transformation more broadly, the research kind of consistently finds that 7 or 8 out of 10 transformations fail, and the primary reason of those that fail is not taking the people along with you. Whether that's in terms of willingness to adopt and use the tools. I could give you something that's amazing and invest a lot of money in it. If you're not going to use it, then that money is completely wasted. So how do you make sure, A, that they can use it, right? They know how to, that's the kind of skills element. But also, how do you kind of showcase the value that it can bring to their day-to-day, and therefore actually adopt it, and make use of it, so that you can actually start seeing results that are captured by the business metrics more broadly. That's what the business transformation was a topic I researched quite a bit, and that's what the literature kind of shows is the biggest factor that comes into it, people. The other thing to bear in mind, and you touched on this a few minutes ago, is that every organization is so different, right? So yes, there are some best practices around identifying your data and, buy-in and things like that. But ultimately, the route you'll take also depends on what that cost-benefit analysis looks for your own company, right? So, and that's why you can end up with very different models, because you can look to what others are doing, and that's great for inspiration and best practices, but ultimately you need to find the balance that works for your own, for your own company's organization. So,
yeah, and you've talked through some, other points around the challenges. Is it takes time, so there might be an overestimation in terms of what the short-term gains may be. This is definitely a long game that we're playing here. Yeah. And the lack of data readiness is that you haven't put the prep in. They haven't sort of been able to find where your unique data is, and it may be in many different forms, and you've just got to find a way of putting that together. But absolutely, I think that there's a lot of opportunity. It's just about eyes wide open to those challenges and the need for a suitable mobilization. Just into the final sort of very quick questions, really. Is there anyone out there that's doing this well? Are there good examples, in your opinion, that's doing this right, that you feel have taken that? You've said that bigger businesses, so that may be maybe a benchmark for us. So that we can look at in terms of best practice.
I'm not sure I would pick any one company, because as you said, it's still early days, and I do get the sense that the field is dominated. The field in terms of like the case studies that you hear about, right? And there's a lot of publicly available information around. They tend to be the large companies, the tech companies. So, for me, the important thing is to kind of check that bias as well and think, okay, that's what they're doing. They seem to be leading. And yes, as I said before, we can look to them for best practices, but what works for my organization, my industry, that will be quite different. And, so I think that's quite important, that the narrative that we get is quite heavily influenced by those two, kind of areas. So it's quite important to, maybe that's a gap in the market, right? In particular for private equity, what's the state of play in private equity, that there's perhaps a need to kind of explore that, research that, understand that better than it has been so far. So I think that's definitely quite important. There's a gap there.
Yeah, definitely the mood music that I'm picking up
Yeah.
with a sort of cohort of PEs, that they're looking at their peers. What are their peers doing? And there might be a press release that's released, but it doesn't really give you much detail. It's just maybe, oh yeah, we're doing stuff with AI. But there's this sense of, well, we might not move until we see our peers moving.
Yeah.
But that could be too late. So I think it's really important that that time is taken to review what those opportunities might be. And that could be at the very, very early stages, just getting a group together that could form your task force and bring that group up to a certain standard where they can start to investigate further what the opportunities for the business or the firm may be. But yeah, I think just waiting may not be the right answer.
There's plenty of examples of companies that perhaps saw a trend, saw something, didn't act on it. And then, I can give you some examples that I've been following in the news. So I think De Beers is quite interesting. I know it's not necessarily in the private equity space, but just more broadly in terms of companies, right? They talked quite a lot in their past releases about the fact that lab-grown diamonds, which is something that a few years ago they didn't think was, important to them, is actually wiping out quite a lot of gains for them. So it's kind of, they knew the trend was there. They could see that this is, there's a new technology that enables companies to manufacture diamonds, but they thought, oh, this technology is, not going to affect us. And it has, it has affected their bottom line. The same happened in healthcare, where companies have been investing for a long time in weight loss drugs. And, it's not like we didn't know about this. The technology was being developed. But companies like Weight Watchers have seen their share price go to like $1 now from $100, because their business model has been completely disrupted by innovation and new technology that was on the horizon, but they didn't act on. So I agree with you that it is important to, not wait until it's too late, for sure.
Last question, because we're definitely coming to time now. But is there a single source of truth when it comes to keeping track on AI for you?
I'm against that, because I think that you can get blindsided by just following one person as the single source of truth. So I follow a lot of different people as a way to understand different things. I know at the breakfast that we were that you had a couple of months ago, the AI Pathfinder, the last one you mentioned, Ethan Mollick, who's great. But there's loads of other people that kind of take very different global perspectives, more kind of concerns around ethics, regulation, data. So yeah, there's not just one person. I think it's important to follow different people so that you can see what's happening across different lenses.
Yeah, and I suppose in your role anyway, you're having to dig into lots of different sources to find a balanced perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of the interesting nuggets can come from questioning what's, commonplace knowledge everywhere as well. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, look, well, this is part of the process of myself learning and our listeners learning, is talking to different people that
Yeah.
have different skill sets, come from different parts of the organization. I think it's really fascinating to see how what their AI journey is, and it's different. I wouldn't be able to categorize people yet, and
Yeah.
who's leaning into it or finding it maybe stressful. I really enjoyed the conversation today with you, Athena. Thank you so much for your time. I assume that you're happy for people to connect with you on LinkedIn, and also to check out Beacon at beaconthoughtleadership.com. But for now,
Absolutely.
thank you very much for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.